Welcome to our fourth week of exploring the third stack in our library, the stack we refer to as the New Testament. Historically, it's a Christian library. Uh, we've looked at the overview of the 27 books. We looked at the Acts of the Apostles describing the history of the Christian movement between Jesus' death and the death of Paul 30 years later. Um, then we looked at the formation of the early Jesus movement, uh, articulated through the letters of Paul's to the churches. Um, this week we're exploring where most readers begin with the Christian library, and that is the four Gospels. Now, it's important to be clear from the beginning concerning the word gospel. Gospel means good news. These four books are books of the good news. Now, these four books are commonly read as biographies, but to write a biography was not the intent of the authors of these books. The best description of the intent of authoring these books that I've read is that these books are the summation of preaching material of four early traditions in the Jesus movement. All four books were the composite works of scholarly members of early faith communities who wrote to have a record of the good news preaching that they had heard about Jesus preaching. Now, Mark was the first book of preaching material to be written. The reason we're certain about that is that scholars can find Mark in both Matthew and Luke. The authors of Matthew and Luke obviously had Mark at their disposal as they authored their books. Mark is short, sweet, to the point, telling the stories of Jesus' faithfulness, being forgiven, and becoming forgiving servants of Jesus, bringing the reign of agape love on earth as it is in heaven. It's interesting to note that this first gospel written has no reference either to the virgin birth or to the appearances of Jesus after Easter Sunday morning. Neither is mentioned. From the perspective of the compilers of the Gospel according to Mark, the message of Jesus was not dependent upon anything else than its truth revealed in the flesh of Jesus, the rabbi in whose life was revealed divine love. That's Mark. Matthew was likely the second compilation of early preaching about Jesus. The obvious question arises, if Mark was written first, why is Matthew the first book in the Christian library? Well, it's because the only library that the early Christian movement had was the Hebrew library. And they had the Hebrew library, and as they were putting the books together for the Christian library, the book that belonged first was the book that was written to convince the Jewish audience, those who were Jewish, to follow Jesus as the Messiah. And so that it was put in first in the list to provide a transition from the Hebrew library to the Christian library. Now, indications of this, Matthew is the one that emphasized the genealogy, that links Abraham with Jesus. He emphasized, Matthew emphasizes throughout the book that Jesus was the long-awaited Messiah. Again, it was a persuasive case for the faithful Jews. You see, the writers of Matthew were trying to convince those with a Jewish background to follow Jesus. Now, the best illustration of what they did as they composed Matthew is the famous Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5-7. Now, practically speaking, realistically, Jesus never preached this sermon. The material, Matthew 5-7, is sprinkled throughout Mark, throughout Luke, throughout John. But Matthew, the authors of Matthew, wanted to package the heart of Jesus' teaching from the get-go in the gospel according to Matthew. And so Jesus' teaching was put together in a nutshell in the Sermon on the Mount. It's a masterful style of preaching and writing. But Matthew can best be understood when its purpose is remembered. That is, to persuade the Jewish audience to follow Jesus. Now, Luke was written later than Matthew, probably around 90 AD, as the first volume of the two-volume set of books written by the same group of authors, Acts of the Apostles, the first volume, Luke, the second volume. Similar to Matthew, but with a different audience. Luke was compiled with preaching material used to convince the non-Jewish, the Gentile audience, to Jesus, who revealed the way of agape love. Not necessarily the Jewish Messiah. He just revealed agape love to the world and the Gentile world. So where do we find the parable of the good neighbor who happened to be a good Samaritan? And who were the Samaritans? The half-breeds, the outcasts of the Jewish community. You don't find the story of the Good Samaritan in Matthew. You find it in Luke, to the Gentile audience, saying Jesus is for everyone. And an illustration of the way it was presented is the story of the Good Samaritan, or the woman at the well. Was she a Jew? No, she was a Samaritan. Again, trying to persuade the Gentile audience to follow Jesus. Then we look after Luke, who sort of rolled out the welcome mat to the Gentiles. We turn to John, the last gospel written with a new audience, those who were Greek in their thinking, that had no room in their understanding of humanity for a spiritual dimension of life. And John said, oh yeah, we have a spiritual dimension. Indeed, that spiritual dimension is when we capture the truth of Jesus, talking about agape, divine love, as the linkage between the human dimension of a spiritual dimension in our life, linking with the divine, that indeed we become agape love incarnate forevermore. more. Martin Luther started the Reformation movement, the Protestant movement. And Martin Luther said about John's gospel, he said, John's gospel is the one tender, true, chief gospel, far to be preferred to the other three and placed high above them all. These four gospels were selected for inclusion in the Christian library not because they were written first, but because these were the prominent case statements for Jesus, being the one to follow because of his life and teachings were totally absorbed by and committed to the way of agape love. In conclusion, it's important to remember that the two characteristics that enabled the Jesus movement to be distinguished from the Jewish religion was one, that faith was to be experienced in community, and secondly, that included in faith was a missionary zeal to share the good news with others. You see, these two characteristics were as prevalent in the Gospels as they were in Paul's letters to the churches and the history described in the Acts of the Apostles. You see, these two characteristics of the Jesus movement dominated the movement in the 4th century when the Christian library was put in place and Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were the preaching material of the early church. A short summary of the powerful witness to the truth that Jesus was about the divine love, agape love of God. Lot to think about, lot to talk about. Couple questions. First of all, what's your response to the understanding that the four Gospels are case statements for the good news to different audiences rather than biographies of Jesus? Secondly, what are the possible reasons for Martin Luther's position that of the four Gospels, the Gospel of John was the strongest case statement for Jesus? Enjoy your thought. Enjoy our conversation. Thank you for being a part of our journey to our library.